So if we're talking about how we think about our food and how we interact with our food, we can also talk about the social and symbolic nature of food. And so food can unite us when we're together, and it can tie us symbolically when we're apart. So if you think about comfort foods, for example, so they can connect us symbolically to our home, our family, or tradition. And I think I've told you before, I'm from West Virginia, and we have a food that does not exist elsewhere. It's called pepperoni rolls, and there might be some imitators, but none of them are correct in how they make this food. And for me, living in Colorado, I miss West Virginia a lot. And so sometimes when you're missing home or things like that, you can eat a food that brings you back to that place, that takes you back home. And so things like comfort foods, pepperoni rolls for me would be one of those. But we also think about foods that your mom used to make or that your family would traditionally make. And so that food can connect you back to your home, your family, or some sort of tradition. We do it on a broader cultural level with an easy example in the U.S. is something like hot dogs that can kind of symbolically bring us together and represent summertime or represent holidays like 4th of July, Memorial Day, things like that. And so food does more than just provide us with nutrition. It can indicate things about our culture and about our relationships with other people. Another example would be food communicating power, division between classes of people or socioeconomic status. So things like sumptuary laws. So this is where you're limiting consumption of specific food items along class lines. So only upper class individuals can have X type of food, and that people in lower classes can't have that. So if you're consuming that food or you have access to that food, then you automatically are part of the upper class. Okay. And so the symbolic nature of food is really, really powerful and has been studied quite a bit. So if you're interested in this, it's going to be super easy for you to find some really good examples. Your book doesn't dive into it quite as much as other textbooks do, and we don't really have time here, but it's a really important part of our relationship with food, is what it symbolizes and what it means to us as individuals and as a culture. We can also think about food indicating social boundaries and also indicating identity. So a really good quote from an anthropologist here: one's place in a social system is revealed by what, how much, and with whom one eats. So saying that your place within your culture and within the system of your culture is indicated by what you're eating, how much of it you're eating, and the people with which you're eating or with whom you're eating. Okay, so preferences, etiquette, and taboo can mark social boundaries and identity. So what you prefer to eat. A good example in the U.S. is something like caviar. Caviar seems to symbolize high status and high socioeconomic status and high prestige. So if you're eating caviar, that's like a fancy food, right? And so it indicates this higher status. Etiquette as well, knowing which side of the plate in U.S. or English culture the fork and the knife go on, the spoon, things like that. Knowing how to set a fancy table would indicate social status as well. And then how you hold your fork. Some people hold their forks like this, where the fork is kind of coming out of here and they eat like a shovel, that will indicate lower status or lower prestige than holding a fork what we consider the proper way. Okay. So we can also think about eating practices marking gender differences, ethnic or regional differences, and professional or class status. People often ask, like, how does eating mark gender differences? Well, when a woman eats, we have to be dainty and careful with how we eat. So it's often talked about going on a date, a first date especially. As a woman, you don't order what you want to eat. Maybe I want to have a hamburger or I want to have wings, but that's not what I eat. Or I choose the salad, or I choose something that's not going to be messy, something I don't have to use my hands to eat. Because as a woman, I'm not supposed to do that. I'm not supposed to be in polite company, let's say, holding my food or having food on my face or having to lean over a plate to eat a hamburger or something like that. Okay. You'll see women cutting their food a lot smaller, or cutting food that men won't cut. So you'll see women cut sandwiches or things like that into smaller pieces. Of course, these aren't rules that every single woman will abide by all of the time, but in specific company or when she's trying to make a specific impression, she might eat differently. Okay. So not just what we choose to eat, but how we choose to eat it can mark these differences. Ethnic and regional differences is a little easier to kind of latch on to. So eating foods that are based on your ethnicity, so eating Chinese food or eating collard greens, those are going to be examples. And then professional or class status, these are going to be things like what we might consider a fancy food or a very prestigious food to be eating. Okay, so a more specific example, or a couple examples I believe here, in variety stratification in gender. So Spiller in 99 is studying a community in Mali in West Africa, okay? And so in that culture, they see a varied diet. So eating a lot of different types of food is actually for people who are very poor, who are actually so poor that they will eat anything that is available to them. Because they don't have access to food that they want to eat, they will eat everything that comes across their plate. Everything that comes in front of them, they will eat. In our culture, eating a variety of foods or a varied diet is a indication of a higher status individual, someone who can afford to eat all sorts of different things. Even just think about like a surf and turf meal. You're getting steak and lobster and then some side. And so you have a varied diet all on this one plate. That is something that is seen as fancier or higher class. Okay. You also will see food preferences linked to social processes or differences, and so more specifically social stratification or gender, which we've kind of talked a little bit about, but a couple examples. So in Ghana, upwardly mobile people will drink bottled beer rather than homemade beer. So just having a bottled beer in your hand indicates that you are of a higher social status than someone else because you can afford that beer. You can go and get that beer. You aren't forced to make it in your own home. Another gender example, so a group of farmers in Thailand, the men will prefer to eat raw meat and blood, while women are expected to be slightly disgusted and repulsed by this behavior and by raw meat or blood. Okay. While both men and women are equally capable of eating that food, the difference comes from a cultural standpoint, where women are expected to be disgusted or repulsed by that, while men are showing their manliness or their strength by eating these things. And so what we're indicating here is that just like other aspects of culture, foodways, or what we choose to eat, how we eat it, and the rules associated with that, seems very stable. Right? It seems pretty stable that we eat what we eat, and that's how it's always been, but really it's very dynamic. What we eat can change based on a lot of different factors, but things like the environment, so what is able to be grown, perceived healthiness of foods, that can change pretty frequently. So we've seen a big push kind of recently for things like kale, which now is supposed to be very, very healthy for you, when previously it was seen as just a garnish or something that we didn't really eat. So perceived healthiness can affect that. Processing technology, so things become more easy to process, and then the access to those things is increased and is available to a broader audience or a wider range of people. Affordability can change. This can be related to technology as well, but also environmental factors. So things like walnuts are very expensive. They require a lot of water. And so they're expensive to produce, which means they're expensive for the customer, which means that we don't eat them as much. And then we can see changes in things like socially motivated eating habits, the example being convenience foods. So when we started to see women entering the workplace, working more, we saw a shift in the U.S. away from large spreads of homemade meals to more convenience foods, because we had both parents in the workplace. Traditionally, women were home to cook large dinners. So when the children would come home from work and the husband would come home, or the children would come home from school and the husband would come home from work, there'd be a large dinner prepared by the wife. But when we started to see women working a lot more frequently, we started to see a shift towards convenience foods, so foods that we can buy and create very quickly, or takeout, or fast foods. We can also see changes in foodways or what we eat based on trade. Okay, you can have trade between people or groups of people because maybe we don't have access to a certain food here in my made-up culture, but the neighboring culture has that food, and so we'll trade. And so this introduces a new food to us and a new relationship with that food. Maybe only the people who can travel by boat to the next community can actually acquire that new food. So when they bring it back, not only have they introduced a new food, but they've also introduced a new social relationship with that food, because now it's very rare. Only people who have a boat and have that level of status can actually even access this food. So trade and things like that can change our relationships with food and can alter the culture even on a broader level. We can also see changes in foodways shaped by political and economic processes like globalization. So we had an influx of cheap American corn to Mexico due to globalization, right? We had the ability to ship corn to Mexico. And what happened was maize farmers in Mexico were being overrun, and they couldn't keep up with this huge influx of very cheap corn. Okay, and so now we might be looking at extinction of some varieties of corn, of maize grown in Mexico, because it's not really feasible for the farmers to be producing that and selling it. Okay, and so it's making it also more difficult for people in the areas to have access to traditional staple foods, and so it's changing the culture a bit. And if part of your culture is made up around processing the food and cooking the food and the relationships that occur between people in those specific processes, no longer having access to those foods can actually damage the culture and damage those relationships.